Portugal is a small country, smaller than most American states. You could fit it inside Pennsylvania and still have room left over. And yet, for nearly 500 years, this tiny strip of land on the edge of Europe controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, pieces of India, a foothold in China, trading posts scattered across Africa and Asia like breadcrumbs. At its peak, Portugal owned roughly half the planet on paper. Then it all slipped through their fingers, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, painfully, one disaster at a time. A king who vanished in the desert, a wedding that doomed the entire kingdom, a Dutch fleet nobody saw coming, an earthquake that swallowed the capital in under 10 minutes, and finally, a revolution started by flowers. So how does the smallest country in Western Europe build the biggest empire on Earth? And more importantly, how do they lose it so completely that today most people don't even remember they had it? To understand that, we have to go back to a kingdom nobody took seriously. A place so poor and isolated that the rest of Europe basically forgot it existed. In the early 1400s, Portugal had maybe 1 million people, that's it. France had 15 times more. Spain had 8 times more. Even England, sitting on a rainy island, had triple the population. Portugal had no gold, no spices, no fertile farmland to speak of. What it had was an enormous coastline and absolutely nothing else worth fighting over, which turned out to be the most valuable thing in the world. They just didn't know it yet. If this is your kind of story, the rise and fall kind where empires are built by accident and destroyed by stupidity, you'll probably want to subscribe. Anyway, the man who started all of this was a prince who barely ever sailed anywhere himself. His name was Henry, and history would call him the Navigator, which is hilarious because he mostly stayed at home. What Henry did was fund expeditions. He sent ship after ship down the coast of Africa, paid for by his own family fortune, hunting for something nobody in Europe had managed to find yet. A sea route around Africa, a way to reach the spices and silks of Asia without going through the Middle East. Most of his captains died. The ones who survived came back with maps. And those maps would change everything. For decades, Portuguese sailors kept pushing further south along the African coast, and for decades, they kept hitting the same wall. Africa just kept going. Every time a captain came home, the map got a little longer and the question got a little louder. Does this continent ever end? In 1488, a captain named Bartholomew Dias finally got his answer. A massive storm blew his ships so far south they lost sight of land completely. When the weather cleared, he turned east expecting to find more African coast. Instead, he found open ocean. He had rounded the bottom of Africa without even realizing it. The crew wanted to keep going. Dias wanted to keep going. But his men were exhausted, the supplies were running low, and after a brief mutiny, he turned the ships back toward Portugal. When he reported what he'd found, the king named the southern tip the Cape of Good Hope, because hope was exactly what it gave them. A sea route to India was finally possible. We've been sailing for 2 years, and we still haven't reached India. We've reached the bottom of Africa. The bottom of Africa is not India, it's halfway. Halfway is also not India. We'll send another expedition. With who? Everyone who came back from this one looks like a ghost. We'll find volunteers. Nobody volunteers for this. They will when they hear about the spices. 10 years later, in 1498, a captain named Vasco da Gama actually did it. He sailed around the Cape, up the east coast of Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to a port called Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. He arrived with 4 ships, a crew that was mostly dead from scurvy, and trade goods so cheap the local merchants laughed at him. But that didn't matter, because he made it home. And the cargo he brought back, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, was worth 60 times what the entire voyage had cost. 60 times. One trip. Lisbon went insane. Every merchant in Portugal started selling whatever they owned to fund the next expedition. The king set up a royal monopoly on the spice trade almost overnight. Within a generation, Portuguese ships were everywhere. East Africa, Persia, India, Malacca. By 1557, they had a permanent base in Macau, right on the coast of China. A country with 1 million people had just stitched together a trading network that reached halfway around the world. But Portugal wasn't the only country that had figured this out. Right next door, Spain had just done something even crazier. In 1492, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to fund a trip west across the Atlantic, betting that he could reach Asia by going the wrong way around the planet. He didn't reach Asia. He bumped into an entirely new continent nobody in Europe knew existed, and suddenly Portugal and Spain were headed for a collision. Both kingdoms were Catholic, both answered to the same pope. So in 1494, they did something that sounds completely unhinged today. They went to the pope and asked him to split the world in half. He literally drew a line down a map of the planet. Everything east of the line belonged to Portugal. Everything west belonged to Spain. The agreement was called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and it carved up continents that hadn't even been mapped yet. Your Holiness, where exactly is the line? About here, that's the middle of the ocean. Yes. And whatever's on this side is ours. Yes. What if there's nothing there? Then you get nothing. What if there's something incredible there? Then you get something incredible. And nobody else has to agree to this. Nobody who matters. What about the people who already live there? Who? 6 years later, in 1500, a Portuguese captain named Pedro Álvares Cabral was sailing to India when he drifted way too far west and accidentally landed on the coast of South America. He just discovered Brazil. And because of where the Tordesillas line happened to be drawn, that gigantic chunk of land, almost half a continent, fell on the Portuguese side. They hadn't even been looking for it. They tripped over it, and it was theirs. By the mid-1500s, Portugal was the wealthiest kingdom in Europe per person. Lisbon had become the trading capital of the world. Gold and spices flowed in. Slaves, tragically, flowed across the Atlantic to work the sugar plantations in Brazil. The Portuguese Empire stretched from Brazil to West Africa, to India, to Indonesia, to Japan, to Macau. 1 million people running a network that touched 4 continents. It should have been impossible. It shouldn't have lasted a generation. But somehow it kept going, until one young king with too much ambition decided he was going to crusade his way to glory, and he marched his entire kingdom off a cliff. His name was Sebastian. He took the throne in 1557 when he was 3 years old, which is exactly as bad an idea as it sounds. By the time he was old enough to actually rule, he'd been raised on stories of Portuguese knights and holy crusades and the glorious destiny of the Catholic kingdom. He didn't want to be a merchant king counting spice profits. He wanted to be a warrior, a legend. He wanted his own reconquista, and he had picked the target, Morocco, North Africa. He was going to invade, convert it to Christianity, and add it to his empire. His advisors begged him not to do it. Your Majesty, Morocco has 50,000 soldiers. We have less than half that. We have God. God did not say anything about Morocco. He spoke to me in a dream. With respect, dreams are not military intelligence. My uncle, the King of Spain, has refused to send troops. Then we will go without him. We don't have enough horses for the cavalry. Then we will fight on foot. In the desert, yes. In armor, yes. In summer, especially in summer. In August 1578, Sebastian marched into Morocco at the head of an army stuffed with most of the Portuguese nobility, every important commander, and a huge chunk of the male aristocracy. They wore full European armor in the Moroccan heat. They got lost. They ran out of water. And when they finally met the Moroccan army at a place called Alcácer Quibir, they got annihilated. Not defeated, annihilated. Sebastian charged into the middle of the battle and vanished. His body was never properly identified. Most of the Portuguese nobles were killed or captured for ransom. The king was 24 years old, unmarried, with no children. The kingdom held its breath. Then it realized something horrible. There was no obvious heir. The closest legitimate claimant to the Portuguese throne was a foreign king, the most powerful monarch in Europe, and Sebastian's own uncle, Philip II of Spain. In 1580, Philip marched his army into Portugal and took the crown. Just like that, the country that had spent 2 centuries staying carefully independent of its giant neighbor was swallowed by it. The Portuguese Empire still existed on paper. The flag was the same. The ships still sailed. But the man giving the orders now sat in Madrid. And Spain had a lot of enemies. Enemies who had been waiting for exactly this moment. For 60 years, Portugal was technically still a country, but really it was just an extension of Spain. Same king, same foreign policy, same enemies. And Spain's biggest enemy at that moment was a small, soggy, recently independent republic up north that nobody had taken seriously a generation earlier. The Dutch, they had just kicked Spanish armies out of their own homeland, and now they were angry, organized, and very, very good at sailing. The Dutch looked at the Portuguese Empire and saw something obvious. Hundreds of trading posts scattered across the world, lightly defended, far from Lisbon, even further from Madrid, and now technically enemy territory. So in 1602, a group of Dutch merchants pooled their money and created something brand new, the Dutch East India Company. The first multinational corporation in history, with its own army, its own navy, and one very simple business plan. So what exactly do? We sail to Asia and take the Portuguese trading posts. Just take them, just take them. The Portuguese have been there for a century. They have forts and garrisons and ships. They also have very long supply lines and a king who lives in Madrid and doesn't care about them. So we just show up and take their stuff, pretty much. And the shareholders are okay with this. The shareholders suggested it. What followed was one of the most aggressive corporate takeovers in human history. The Dutch hit Portuguese ports one by one. Malacca, the choke point of the entire spice trade, fell in 1641. Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, the source of the world's cinnamon, gone by 1658. The trading posts in Indonesia, the forts on the Indian coast. Even chunks of Brazil were briefly seized by a Dutch invasion force that planted a colony in the northeast for nearly 30 years. Portuguese garrisons begged Lisbon for reinforcements. Lisbon begged Madrid. Madrid was busy fighting wars in 5 other places and shrugged. By the time Portugal finally rebelled against Spanish rule and got its independence back in 1640, half the empire was already gone. The Spice Islands, the cinnamon, the pepper monopoly. The richest trading routes in Asia. All of it had quietly been transferred to a company in Amsterdam, paid for in Portuguese blood. Portugal still had Brazil, the African colonies, Goa, Macau, and a handful of stubborn outposts. But it would never again be the dominant trading power in the East. The empire that had ruled the oceans was now just one of several minor players, and the next disaster was already on the way. This one wouldn't come from a navy. It would come from the ground itself. November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, a Catholic holiday which meant Lisbon was packed. The churches were full. Candles were lit on every altar. Families were sitting down for the holiday meal. The harbor was crowded with ships. The streets were crowded with people. At 9:40 in the morning, the ground started shaking. The Lisbon earthquake is still considered one of the worst natural disasters in recorded European history. Modern geologists estimate it was somewhere around a magnitude 8.5. The shaking lasted nearly 6 minutes. Stone buildings, including most of the city's grand churches, collapsed onto the people praying inside them. Survivors ran into the streets, away from the falling stones, and headed for the open ground near the harbor, which was the worst possible place to be, because 40 minutes later, the ocean disappeared. What's happening to the water? It's just pulling back. There are fish flopping on the seabed. The whole harbor is empty. Where did it go? I don't know. We should leave. We should leave now. Why? Because water doesn't do that without coming back. A tsunami the size of a building hit the city. 3 of them actually, one after another. Survivors of the earthquake who had run to the open spaces near the river were swept away. And then, because the city was full of holiday candles knocked over by the shaking, fires broke out everywhere. The fires burned for 5 days. By the time it was over, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people were dead. Most of central Lisbon was gone. The royal palace, the opera house, the libraries holding centuries of records from the empire, all of it, ashes. The man who pulled Portugal out of the wreckage was a tough, ruthless prime minister called the Marquis of Pombal. When someone asked him what should be done, his answer became famous: bury the dead and feed the living. He rebuilt Lisbon in a grid pattern with earthquake-resistant designs that engineers still study today. But the city was never the same. The treasure from Brazilian gold mines that had been flowing into Lisbon for decades was now being funneled into rebuilding instead of investing in the empire. Portugal had survived, but it was bleeding money, exhausted, and quietly slipping further behind England and France with every passing year. And then in 1807, another army showed up on the border. This time it was led by the most dangerous man in the world, Napoleon. Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, and he had one big remaining enemy: Britain. The British Navy was too strong to invade directly, so Napoleon tried to strangle Britain economically instead. Every country in Europe had to stop trading with the British. No exceptions. There was just one small problem. Portugal had been Britain's closest ally for nearly 500 years. The two countries had a treaty going back to 1386. Portugal politely refused to break it. Napoleon was not the kind of man who took refusals politely. He invades immediately. Your Majesty, we cannot fight Napoleon. We have 13,000 soldiers. He has 80,000 and they are already at the border. Then what do you propose? We leave. Leave where? Brazil. You want me to abandon Portugal? I want you to keep being king. If we stay, Napoleon makes you a puppet. If we go to Brazil, you keep your crown, your treasury, your government. And Portugal will be here when Napoleon is gone. Will it? Eventually. In November 1807, the entire Portuguese royal court, around 15,000 people, packed onto every ship in Lisbon harbor and sailed for Brazil. The royal family, the nobles, the government, the national treasury, the libraries, the printing presses, everything. 2 days after they left, Napoleon's army marched into an empty capital. For the first time in history, a European monarchy had moved its entire government to a colony. And for 13 years, the Portuguese Empire was effectively run from Rio de Janeiro. Rio loved it. The royal family loved it. King Joe VI liked Brazil so much he didn't even want to go back. The colony got an opera house, a national library, a royal printing press, universities. It was raised to the status of a kingdom equal to Portugal itself. Brazilians started thinking of themselves not as colonists, but as citizens of an empire centered on their own soil. And when Napoleon was finally defeated and João reluctantly sailed back to Lisbon in 1821, he left his son Pedro behind as regent. The Portuguese parliament demanded Pedro come home too and put Brazil back in its old colonial place. Pedro thought about it for about 5 seconds. Then, on the banks of a small river in 1822, he drew his sword and declared Brazil independent. He crowned himself emperor of his own brand new country. Portugal had just lost the single biggest piece of its empire, a territory 92 times larger than Portugal itself. Gone. Forever. Losing Brazil broke something in Portugal that never really healed. The country had defined itself for 3 centuries as the kingdom that owned half of South America. Without Brazil, what was it? A small European nation with some leftover scraps in Africa and Asia. The economy collapsed. The monarchy lurched from crisis to crisis. There were civil wars, coups, exiles, and a brief period where there were 2 rival kings claiming the throne at the same time. Portugal was no longer a great power. It was a country trying very hard to pretend it still was, so the government turned its attention to the colonies it still had. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, Cape Verde, São Tomé, Goa, Macau, East Timor. The African territories, especially, became the new obsession. If Portugal couldn't have Brazil, it would build a new empire across Africa instead. There was just one problem. Every other European power had the same idea. In the 1880s, the great powers of Europe held a meeting in Berlin and basically did to Africa what the Pope had done to the world 4 centuries earlier. They drew lines on a map and divided the continent up between themselves. Portugal showed up to the meeting with an ambitious plan. They wanted to connect Angola on the west coast to Mozambique on the east coast, drawing a pink stripe across the middle of Africa that would link their 2 colonies into one giant territory. It became known as the Pink Map. Britain looked at the Pink Map and said no. Britain had its own plan for that exact stretch of land, a railway from Cairo to Cape Town, through, awkwardly, the same area Portugal wanted. You can't have it. We have ships there, we have soldiers there, we have flags planted, we have a bigger navy. That doesn't matter, this is our claim. It matters quite a lot, actually. Britain is our oldest ally. Then it would be a shame to lose that alliance. You're threatening us, I'm asking politely, with a fleet. The fleet is unrelated. In 1890, Britain sent Portugal an ultimatum: withdraw from the contested territory or face war. Portugal, broke, humiliated, and militarily helpless, withdrew. The Pink Map died overnight. Public outrage was so intense that it nearly toppled the monarchy. Riots broke out in Lisbon. A new national anthem was written, full of bitter references to British betrayal. And 20 years later, in 1910, a revolution finally did topple the monarchy. Portugal became a republic. But its problems were just getting started. The Portuguese Republic was a mess, 45 governments in 16 years, constant coups, riots, assassinations. By 1926, the army had had enough and seized power. A few years later, a quiet, severe economics professor named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was put in charge of the finances. He was so good at balancing the budget that within a few years he had effectively taken over the entire country. By 1933, Salazar was the dictator of Portugal. He would rule for nearly 4 decades. Salazar's philosophy was simple. Portugal would stay poor, rural, Catholic, and obedient. No labor unions. No opposition parties. No free press. And above all, no losing any more of the empire. While the rest of Europe spent the 1950s and 1960s peacefully handing independence to their African colonies, Salazar refused. Britain let India go. France let Algeria go. Belgium let the Congo go. Salazar dug in his heels. The other empires are gone, sir. Britain has given up nearly all of theirs. We are not Britain. France has lost Algeria after a brutal war. We are not France. The world is changing. Portugal is not the world. The Africans want independence. The Africans are Portuguese. They do not feel Portuguese. They will. The United Nations is condemning us. The United Nations does not understand us. In 1961, independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau took up arms. Portugal sent in soldiers, and then more soldiers, and then more. For 13 years, Portugal fought a brutal, expensive, unwinnable war on 3 different fronts in Africa. By the early 1970s, nearly half of the entire national budget was being poured into the colonial wars. Young Portuguese men were drafted, shipped across the ocean, and many of them came home in coffins. The economy stagnated. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese emigrated to France and Germany just to find work. Salazar himself died in 1970, but his successor kept the wars going. The Portuguese army, which had been fighting these wars personally, slowly came to a conclusion their own government refused to accept. The wars were unwinnable. The empire was already lost in everything but name, and the country was being bled dry to maintain a fiction. A group of young officers started meeting in secret. They called themselves the Armed Forces Movement. They had a plan, not to win the wars, to end them, and to take down the dictatorship that refused to admit they were over. April 25, 1974. Just after midnight, a Lisbon radio station played a banned folk song called Grandola, Vila Morna. It was the signal. Military units across the country, led by young officers who had been fighting in Africa, moved on government buildings, radio stations, and the Prime Minister's residence. The dictatorship had expected a bloodbath. Instead, almost no one fired a shot. As soldiers rolled through the streets of Lisbon, ordinary people poured out of their houses to cheer them on. A flower seller in a city square started handing out red carnations from her stall. Soldiers stuck them in the barrels of their rifles. By morning, the dictatorship was finished, and the revolution had a name: the Carnation Revolution. The new government did the only sensible thing left to do. It ended the wars. Within 18 months, every single Portuguese colony in Africa was independent. Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé. Gone, all of them, almost overnight. East Timor declared independence in late 1975 and was promptly invaded by Indonesia 9 days later, beginning a tragedy that would last another 24 years. Goa had already been taken by India back in 1961. The last piece, Macau, was peacefully handed over to China in 1999. And just like that, after almost 600 years, the Portuguese Empire was over. The country that had once owned half the world was back to being a small nation on the edge of Europe, roughly the size of Indiana, around 10 million people, the same as where it had started. But the legacy is still everywhere if you know where to look. Portuguese is now the official language of more than 250 million people across 9 countries on 4 continents. Brazil alone has more Portuguese speakers than the entire population of Portugal multiplied by 20. The food, the architecture, the music, the genetics, the religion. From Salvador to Luanda to Goa to Macau, the empire didn't really vanish. Like the Mongols, it dissolved into the cultures it had once tried to dominate, and it kept living through them. Portugal lost half the world. Slowly, painfully, one disaster at a time. A king who chased a dream into the desert. A treaty that gave away Brazil overnight. An earthquake. A French emperor. A British ultimatum. A dictator who couldn't let go. And finally, a quiet revolution started by a flower. But if you think this story is wild, wait until you hear what happened to the Spanish Empire next door, because somehow theirs ended even worse.